Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
The legacy of Frederick Douglass still reverberates through the conflicts that rippled through the Eastern Shore. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. In front of the Talbot County Courthouse stand two statues. One of Frederick Douglass, commissioned in 2011, and another called the Talbot Boys of a young Confederate soldier erected just over 50 years after the Civil War. They stand 51 feet apart on either side of the walkway. David Blight has authored a new biography entitled Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. And he explores the development of Douglass from his early years as a slave to become one of the most recognizable leaders in 19th century America. We have David on the phone, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Don. Thanks so much for having me.
So, first of all, describe for me the kind of world that Douglass was born in terms of what did the Eastern Shore look like, what was its structure, how endemic was slavery to this particular region?
Slavery was a pretty big deal on the Eastern Shore, especially in Talbot County and a bit further south, Dorchester County. Douglass was born, of course, out along the Tuckahoe River, and probably his grandmother Betsy's cabin on what then was called the Home Hill Farm. It's just east of Easton. This wasn't the greatest soil, but it was good farming soil. And then he, of course, grew up in part, at least as a small boy, at the Y House, at the Great Y Plantation, which was the biggest property, the biggest slaveholding operation in all of Maryland, owned by the Lloyds. And there he would have he did experience, and he wrote poignantly about almost an industrial system of production on the many farms and thousands of acres of the Y Plantation. It was primarily tobacco and then grains, corn and wheat, for the market. There was very little cotton of any sort on the Eastern Shore, probably none. But slavery was a very big part of Eastern Shore antebellum economies, as was slave trading. That is, slaves that were sold away from the Eastern Shore south to Virginia and even further south to the Southwest slave trade. On the other hand, when he went to Baltimore, it was a different matter. But on the Eastern Shore, Douglass lived primarily among slaves, and occasionally he would have met a free black person, but he doesn't encounter free blacks in any significant way until he goes up to Baltimore.
And that's interesting because on the Eastern Shore, I know that there were actually various communities of free blacks. I think there's one particularly in Easton, and yet he seemed to be blocked off from that society.
He was, primarily because he's only through the age of 6, almost 7, when he's taken by his grandmother to the Y Plantation. He lived a year and a half at the Y, and then he's sent to Baltimore when he's only 7, and he doesn't come back to he comes back to the Eastern Shore that first year to be divided up. When Aaron Anthony died, that was his owner, and all of Anthony's slaves were divided up amongst his kinfolk. He was given to Thomas Auld, who then sent him back to Baltimore, which was one of Douglass's strokes of good luck. But he did not, in those years, spend any time to speak of at all in Easton. He will come back to the Eastern Shore as a teenager, and he will live primarily in St. Michael's, or on the land not far from St. Michael's, on Edward Covey's farm, and then on the Freeland farm, where he lived each place a year as a teenager. But he had very little experience with Easton. In fact, his experience with Easton, unfortunately, was when he was jailed after his aborted and failed escape plot on William Freeland's farm when he's about 18. He spent 2 weeks in the Easton County Jail, which is right there and still existing Talbot County Courthouse. Right on the back of that courthouse is where the jail was, and that's where Douglas spent 2 weeks until Thomas Auld came in and told him he was almost miraculously sending him back to Baltimore and not selling him south. But he was just turned 18 when that happened.
So how did the experience at the Y plantation shape him? What was his experience like? What did he learn from that experience? As you say, it was only about 18 months.
Yeah, he learned a great deal, and he wrote quite lyrically about it in the autobiographies. He remembered that's where he first has vivid memories, because he's 6, 7 years old. He has lots of memories of nature. Blackbirds flying over him, which for him became symbols of freedom. The sounds of the Y plantation, the work life of the Y plantation. He writes also quite lyrically and even painfully about the differences between the house slaves who worked up in the big house and all the other slaves who were down in the quarters or out in the fields. He writes unforgettably about what he called Allowance Day, when all of the slaves from all over the various Y farms would come into the big house, or the environment of the big house. He called it the Great House, and they would get their allowances of cornmeal and other goods and even clothing. And that's where Douglas even remembers hearing the songs, slave songs, as people were walking toward the Y House. He also vividly remembers the stables and the carriage houses, and how he loved to go kind of play amongst the horses and the carriages. But perhaps most vividly, and this is what happens with our childhood memory, I think, he particularly remembers some of the vicious beatings he witnessed. He remembers seeing the old man who ran the stables forced to his knees and beaten by Colonel Lloyd himself. And then he remembers watching a slave woman named Nellie savagely beaten by an overseer. He remembers hearing the stories of a slave named Denby who gets killed in a runaway attempt. So he has tremendous traumatic memories of the Y plantation. At the same time, he describes it various ways as both a kind of Eden-like place, he calls it that, but also a sort of prison. An Eden and a prison. And again, to read Douglas about the Y House plantation is a fascinating journey into just how one remembers childhood. And we all probably associate our memories with childhood with those events that were the most emotionally or physically riveting. Experiences that leave emotional traces in the memory. That's how memory works. So the richness of his memories of his time at the Y, even though it wasn't a long period, is remarkable.
Did he have much interaction in terms of the White family, aside obviously from the beatings he saw from Lloyd? Did he have any friends or any connection? What was that like?
He didn't initially, no, but he does later. After the Civil War, when the famous Frederick Douglass returned to the Eastern Shore. He makes actually several returns to the Eastern Shore. One of them was to actually the Y plantation, where, the direct descendant of Colonel Lloyd was at that point, I think, the grandson. But that grandson chose not to be home that day and was off on business in Easton, as Douglas told it. And an 18-year-old son hosted him when Douglas literally visited the Y House, sat on the veranda, went into the house. It probably was the first time he ever set foot inside that house. He also brought a copy of The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, his third autobiography, and left it at the house. And Richard Tillman and his wife, who live there now, who are themselves, or one of them is, a direct descendant of the Lloyds, they still have that copy of The Life and Times. He later developed closer relationships, actually, with the son and daughter of Thomas Auld, who was his second owner. But Auld did not live or work much of his time at the White House. Auld lived off in St. Michael's.
So he is now sent up to Baltimore. Tell me a little bit about how that occurred and what seemed to, I think he describes as sort of opening up an entire world that he did not realize even existed.
Yes, indeed. He eventually calls it his Baltimore dreams. He's first sent there when he's 7 years old to be the companion of a little boy named Tommy Auld, a white boy, who was the son of Sophia and Hugh Auld. Hugh Auld was Thomas Auld's brother. So here's his slave owner sending him to Baltimore to be the companion of his nephew. And that was the most important break, if you like, of Douglas's life, that is to live in Baltimore, where he attains literacy, possibly the most important possession Douglas ever had. He's in a major ocean port city at that point. Baltimore, as it still is, but then was a major maritime port, a major shipbuilding port. He eventually gets jobs down along the docks. And by the time he's a teenager, that's where he learns the trade of caulking, among other things. He gets into some tussles and some fights along the docks, too. But the city of Baltimore, in his 2 stints of living there, which added up to, I think, about 9 years of his 20 years as a slave, he lives about 11 of them on the Eastern Shore and about 9 of them in Baltimore, and 2 extensive stints. Baltimore became the place where he could see that there was a larger world, where he finds his path to literacy. He attends black and white churches. He meets lots of people in the free black community. In the year that Douglas escaped, in 1838, Baltimore had about 130,000 people, but only about 3,000 slaves, and yet about 17,000 free blacks. It was a very significant free black population with its own churches, its own alternative economies, and so on. And it's also in that community, somewhere when he was 18 or 19, when he appears to have met Anna Murray, the woman he would eventually marry, who would become his first wife. She was a free black woman, born right out on the Eastern Shore, just on the other side of the Tuckahoe, from Douglas, from where Douglas was born. And it's even possible that he and Anna, as children, she was about 3 years older, but it's possible they had played at that same mill on the Tuckahoe as kids, because that's where everybody went. Don't know that for sure. But he meets her in Baltimore in his late teenage years, and she plays a role in helping him escape when he's 20 years old.
Now, she seems almost strange in terms of a companion because she's illiterate. She is not someone who ultimately wound up being engaged politically and publicly, as certainly Douglas did. Do you have any sense about what attracted Douglas?
Well, it's hard to say entirely, except that when they meet, she's a young woman, early 20s by then, who works as a domestic in a white people's home. She has a job. She has a certain stability about her. She was, in all likelihood, quite involved in a local church. And Douglas probably would have met her at perhaps a church gathering. There was also a debating society that he got involved in Baltimore, in the free black community. At some kind of free black community gathering is probably where they met. And who is he at that point but a late teenage slave working down on the docks, dreaming his way out of Baltimore? He's not the world-class writer that we know him later. And he probably could have cared less that Anna didn't read or write yet. And she played a role when he escaped, more than a role. Her bravery was the same as his bravery, because she had her bags packed and waited for the letter to arrive that someone would have read to her, that Douglas had successfully escaped into New York City. And her bags were packed, and she took the same trains and the same ferry boats across the same rivers through the same 36-hour trek that he did, and risked everything herself. If she'd have been caught doing this, her life, her livelihood would have been in danger. So they arrive in New York. They're this young, frightened couple who obviously had fallen in love. They move up to New Bedford. They are going to have 5 children over the next decade. And he had himself a perfect companion. He had a helpmeet. He had a woman who would raise the children and keep a home. And that's what he desperately needed in those years. You know, like some other marriages, they grew into different people, very different people. And it is true that Anna remained largely a non-reader and non-writer the rest of her life. It is a difficult marriage over time. It is fraught with obstacles of many kinds. The most famous African-American writer, orator, intellectual by the 1850s, 60s, 70s is married to a woman who did not, in any deep way, share his public life. She almost never traveled with him. But she was clearly and obviously crucial in the raising of Douglas's 5 children, 4 of whom lived to adulthood.
I wanted to ask you, by the way, there's probably a seminal event in his life, which is the confrontation with Edward Covey, before obviously he's escaped. Describe that for me, and it seems as if he finds his own dignity, his own freedom, as it were, even within, obviously, the slave environment.
Yeah, it's certainly the way he writes about it. He was hired out by Thomas Auld in St. Michael's to Edward Covey, whose farm was only about 2 or at most 3 miles outside of St. Michael's. I think it's just west of there. For a better part of a year, when he's about 16. Going on 17. He's a rebellious youth by then. He remembers just never being fed enough. He doesn't want to work in Thomas Auld's kitchen, and he doesn't want to do anything they want him to do. He's been to Baltimore. He's seen the city. He's the kid who's been to the city. And now he's back on the Eastern Shore, and he's treated like a chattel. And so Auld can't handle him, and he hires him out to this Covey, who was known to be effective in correcting or breaking, if you like, rebellious slaves. And Douglas spent the better part of a year under Covey's control and Covey's whip, until Douglas decided, according to the way he remembers it and tells it, to stand up to Covey one day, and he fought him in and around the barn on Covey's farm, and bested Covey, according to Douglas, beat the hell out of him, if you like, and after which, he says, Covey never laid a hand on him. Now, he constructs that as a writer. You got to remember, Douglas, when writing this up, has become a very self-conscious artist as a writer, and the way Douglas portrays that scene is as a kind of resurrection through violence, a very male story of, recreating himself through the act of standing up and fighting Covey. At the end of that period, he is sent off to the Freeland farm up the road, to a very different kind of hired master. Freeland never beat his slaves. Douglas was actually quite amazed at that. But there he just worked every day as a field hand in the fields. But that fight with Covey does become a kind of pivot of his autobiography, at least of his early life. He says famously, I have shown you the way a man was made a slave. Let me now show you how a slave became a man.
Also, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of religion in his thinking, because it seems to permeate, obviously, in all of his writings, all of his speakings, lots of biblical references. What came out of, particularly in terms of religion, in terms of his experience on the Eastern Shore?
Sure. Well, lots of things. He encounters preaching on the Eastern Shore as well as in Baltimore, but Thomas Auld also took him to camp meetings. And Douglas writes vividly about it. He took him along as an early teenager to these camp meetings, and he got to observe, and slaves were brought along. They didn't get to truly participate in the revival. They didn't get to make confession and do testimonies inside the circle, as it was known among Methodists, but he actually witnessed his own owner, Auld, undergo this personal testimony, coming to Jesus, weeping as he confesses his story. And it gave Douglas a tremendous sense of the hypocrisy or the potential hypocrisy of Christianity and of religion, how a slaveholder could kneel on his knees and weep for his sins and pray in front of everyone else and ask God's guidance and forgiveness and all the rest, and yet go right back the next day treating slaves as livestock, as property to be bought and sold. That's where Douglas's great sense of the contradictions and the terrible ironies of making humans into property came from. And one of his most famous speeches, when he goes on the circuit in the 1840s, is what became known as the slaveholder's sermon. And that's where Douglas would mimic a pro-slavery preacher in the South, and he'd heard a few. He knew this performance when slaveholding preachers would get up and say, "Slaves, be loyal to your masters." They would quote from those sections of the Bible that appealed to slaves to be loyal to their masters, and then he would spin that into a vicious critique of the hypocrisy of Christianity, the hypocrisy of slaveholding Christians. But then he's also heard the Bible so much, and especially when he gets to Baltimore is where he starts reading it, and reading it carefully. Eventually with an old black preacher named Charles Lawson, who he makes a big deal of in the narrative, a kind of a storefront preacher who worked as a drayman by day, but loved his Bible, especially the Old Testament. And once he discovered this teenage kid who could really read well, he would sit with Douglas, and Douglas would just read out loud whole sections of Old Testament stories with Lawson. And that's how Douglas started to get language into his head. It's from the King James language of both Old and New Testament. And he attended churches in Baltimore, 4 of them that he names. He even describes the preachers and what he liked about them and didn't like about them. So he's pretty well steeped in the Bible as literature, as storytelling, before he even escapes from slavery.
Now, obviously, he had a relationship with Abraham Lincoln, and obviously Lincoln changes over time, the Emancipation Proclamation and so on, and he seems to see his country changing. But it's not until, I think it's 1876, that he actually finds himself returning to the Eastern Shore. Tell me a little bit about that, and was there a change in Douglas in terms of how he viewed slavery, how he viewed where the country was at the time, and his own, for that matter, personally in his own time?
Oh, sure. There's a lot of change. It's actually 77 when he first returns.
Yes, right.
I think it's the fall of 1877. It's after the disputed election of 1876 and the Compromise of 77, and the relative so-called end of Reconstruction. His views changed. He never could quite forgive, if you like, slaveholders or slavery for forging, his own soul. But of course, the war was now 10 and 12 years in the past. Emancipation had become the great pivot of his history and of the nation's history. By that time, he first returns to the Eastern Shore in 1977, though he's deeply, deeply worried about the retreat from and the abandonment of Reconstruction. But he still holds on to that idea that the great triumph of emancipation in the Civil War had given the United States a chance to totally reinvent itself, to recreate a second American Republic and a second Constitution, and he believed they had in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. He's worried that that's all being eroded and washed away by the Southern Democrats and by terror and violence. But he does go visit, and that may be where you were leading here. It's very important. He goes back in part that first time to visit Thomas Auld, who he believed was on his deathbed. He was very ill in St. Michael's. And when Douglas returned, he had the press in tow with him. He was this famous former slave returning to meet his actual owner. I mean, that's a big news event. And he did meet Auld. Auld was bedridden, and they spent 20 or 25 minutes together, we believe. And it's apparent, in fact, it's more than likely that Douglas went there in part to basically ask Auld, "Are you my father?" Because Douglas never knew who his father was. He always knew his father was white and probably one of his owners, but he never knew for sure. And he spent a lot of energy and time trying to figure it out. And if Auld had told him yes, then Douglas would have told us. So he didn't get a yes out of Auld. What he did get out of Auld is Auld told him he thought when he had been born, because Douglas didn't even know that. Douglas thought he was born in 1817. He was actually born in 1818. And Auld told him that day that he believed it was 1818. Now, the fact that Auld would know that is curious in itself. But he was always in search of who he was and where he was from. This is why the Eastern Shore is so important, not only in forging Douglas, but also in his long life. He returns either physically or in his imagination to try to explain, how did I come from there to here? How did I go from that side of the Chesapeake to this side of the Chesapeake? How did I get from that bend in the Tuckahoe to my big house in Anacostia in Washington, D.C.? How did I get from there to here? It's always what he's trying to understand about himself. And by the way, it's in my book. I found one of the most moving stories of his return to the Eastern Shore is that first visit, 1877, it's November, I think. He visits Auld in St. Michael's, but then the following day he's over in Easton. He gave speeches at 2 churches, black churches. Then he hired a carriage that just took him out east of town, took him out to the Tuckahoe. And he walked back through that field, and he found the little ravine that he remembered, which was right where he remembered his grandma's cabin being, right? The little ravine that came up from the river, which is still there. And he tells us that he even looked for a certain cedar tree that he thought he remembered. And then he knelt on hand and knee, and he scooped up handfuls of soil, put it in a bag, and took it back to Washington with him, as though he was simply trying to take a piece of the Eastern Shore to the Western Shore, and to always sort of hang on to who he was, and emotionally and in his memory. He's also still searching for his mother. Who was she? Where is she? Searching for his father. He doesn't even really know who it is. We all do that to some degree, probably. We tend to return, at least in our minds, to the places we're from to try to figure out who we are.
Finally, he writes three autobiographies, and some have suggested that as he moves through time, that he begins to soften in terms of the slave owners and his experience with them. Do you think that's true? And B, what do you think was happening there for him?
To an extent, he softened, but only to an extent. He tells us, for example, when he met Auld in 1977, that they both wept. They shook hands. They shared a story or two. He tells us that Auld called him Marshal Douglas, because at that point he had been appointed Marshal of the District of Columbia, and Douglas told Auld, no, I'm just Frederick to you, and so on. It led to there were a couple press reports that said Douglas had kneeled in front of Auld and all of this. That's not true. But, yeah, he's growing older. He's trying to understand what's happened to himself and what's happened to the country. For that matter, what's happened to Maryland. But one should never assume that he somehow softened on the problem of slavery or the slavery question. He found it very, very hard to forgive what had been done to him. It doesn't mean that he didn't feel in his mind and heart the dilemmas of the slaveholders themselves. In fact, if anyone carefully reads Douglas's narrative, the first autobiography or the second, My Bondage and My Freedom, one of the main themes of those two autobiographies are his portraits of the slaveholders' mind, of how they were trapped in this system. They grew up in this system, they were trapped in this system, and most of them knew no way to imagine their way out. So he had a certain distance and sympathy for their dilemma. At the same time, he, of course, wanted their society and their structure crushed. And it was in the war. And he was, rest assured, very glad of that.
We've been speaking with David Blight. He is author of a new biography entitled Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, and we appreciate you taking our time to speak with us this morning.
Well, thank you, Don. It's always great to connect with the Eastern Shore.
Thank you. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.